Hi, this is Professor Cahan. This is History 1301, U.S. History 2 1877, and this is Lecture 6, The Coming of the American Revolution. In the previous class, in Lecture 5, we discussed some of the importances of the Great Awakening, and one of the key things about the Great Awakening was that it created the psychological preconditions for the American Revolution. So since we were right at that doorstep of the American Revolution, let's get right to the American Revolution. If we want to look at the causes of the American Revolution, they aren't as simple as just saying it's discontent with Great Britain and their policies. One of the big causes of the Revolutionary War was religion. Now, we're not going to overplay this, and I don't want to turn this into a class on the origins of a Christian nation and anything like that. What I mean by religion is the religious changes within society as a consequence of the Great Awakening. Not that these people are fighting for a specific religious principle, but they're fighting for a specific order within society that allows for a particular type of religious expression. When people start going through changes and disruption, they often turn to religion as they did during the Great Awakening. We saw that with what happened in New England and the spread of it throughout the entirety of the North American colonies. New England also saw growth in their population, growth in wealth during this era. So everybody winds up going through this religious revival in the Great Awakening. Now, when all of this stuff is happening with the Great Awakening, the colonists became transformed. They became more radical as a consequence of the Great Awakening. It's not just a religious revivalism. Remember, among the things that we mentioned in that last class was the idea that God does not work through institutions or through leaders, but rather God works through individuals. That's a critically important notion for these Americans to have in mind, that they are individuals who can actually alter the course of their future. There's a sense of great expectation in the colonies as a consequence of all of this stuff. The Great Awakening spread a massive amount of factionalism throughout the colonies. And rather than worry about which faction is right and which denomination has the right idea, what these people started discussing was the right of free religious expression, that the state or a colonial government does not have the power to tell an individual how they worship. So all of that factionalism created the idea of what we loosely call religious freedom in this country today. The idea of freedom of religious expression. Now, the reality of all of this radicalism and the religiosity of it is the radicalism sticks. It becomes something much more broad in American society. But the religiosity of the Great Awakening is a short term change in American history. By the late 1740s, the Great Awakening had lost steam and kind of just faltered throughout the Americas. Church membership, which had seen an increase in the early parts of the 1700s, had dropped to about 5% in what becomes the United States. By the end of the decade, or excuse me, by the end of the century, it's at 5% in the United States. But again, it's a shared American experience, so there's a psychological aspect that paves the way for the Revolutionary War to actually happen. Now, a second cause for the American Revolution is actually two wars that happen concurrent with one another. And again, this is one of those things where historians and history classes frequently present these two wars as if they are one and the same, as if they're interchangeable terms, and they're actually not interchangeable terms. The wars in this case are the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War was a war that occurred strictly in the Americas, in the American colonies. It was fought between Great Britain, France, and both sides' Native American allies. This war, the French and Indian War, happened from 1754 to 1763. And why I've got on the board here this idea of a global war is that 2 years later, this conflict between Great Britain and France exploded into a much broader global war that dragged in several other countries, including Spain, including Russia, including various German principalities. And that war, which starts in 1756, was called the 7 Years' War. So the 7 Years' War takes place primarily in Europe and the Mediterranean and in parts of northern Africa, while the French and Indian War takes place exclusively on the North American continent. What was remarkable about this is that, again, it is absolutely, in every sense of the phrase, a global war. It's happening amongst multiple countries across the globe. It is being fought in North America, across the plains of Europe, in the Mediterranean Sea, in North African territories, in places as far away as India. So people are fighting this war all across the globe. Now, in all of these areas, with one exception, the war is a stalemate. The only area it's not a stalemate is in North America. The reason for this is the British began pouring more and more resources into North America because they believed that their control of the Atlantic Ocean would enable them to dominate this war in North America. And they rationalized, if we can control the war in North America, this will cause France to go bankrupt. It will cause them to spend more resources, and it will ultimately defeat the French. And it turns out they're kind of right. In terms of a combat perspective, the war is a stalemate, but Great Britain very clearly wins an obvious victory during the French and Indian War phase of all of this. In the end, when this peace treaty is signed to end the French and Indian War, the French are going to be required to give up all of their possessions in North America. They give every bit of this up. But it also has an effect on Great Britain as well. Great Britain wins, but they've got a real problem. And on the board here, you can see that the first real problem is that it doubles Great Britain's national debt. But there's something else that happens to Great Britain as a result of this. This is why maps are so important. If you look at the area that's controlled by the British prior to 1754, and when this war actually begins, they don't control very much of North America. They control the area. If you note on the map on the left, you can see the area that the British controls is pretty much the area of the original 13 colonies, as well as some areas in northern Canada. But in those areas of northern Canada, they aren't actually very well inhabited. The British have virtually no presence there, so they own it, quote unquote, but they don't really have much control over that area. You can see that the much bigger area of control belongs to the French. So the French agree, we will give up our possessions. We will leave North America. That doesn't mean that the British get all of it. Okay, the British wind up getting a large amount of it, as you can see on the map on the right. They wind up taking everything east of the Mississippi River, including the province of Quebec, which is made up of today the upper parts of the upper Midwest and parts of Canada. They take over that area that you can see that's labeled the Indian Reserve, which is essentially the Ohio Valley region that includes Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, parts of Tennessee today, all the way down to Florida. That Indian Reserve is part of newly ceded territory to the British. But west of the Mississippi, France made a gamble. Before the peace treaty was signed, they knew that they were going to have to give up their control over territory in North America. So what they gambled on was giving the area west of the Mississippi River, and indeed control of the Mississippi River, they gave that to Spain because they believed that Spain was more closely aligned with their ideas about global power. So Spain and France would be allied in the future, and the French would still have some entree into North America. So they make this gamble and do all of this. This literally, this whole process not only doubles Great Britain's uh, national debt, which is a problem, but it also doubles the area that they have to administer in North America. You can see again, if you look at the map on the left versus the map on the right, Great Britain has far more territory under their control. They've got to deal with not only the American colonists who live in the original 13 colonies, but as the term Indian Reserve states or suggests, they've got a large Native American population in that Indian Reserve that they also have to administer. So they're also going to be dealing with future Indian problems as well. And the reason I mentioned the national debt right off the bat, Great Britain is a mercantilist country. And if you remember when I defined mercantilism a couple of lectures back, it's about economic control by the state in order to enhance the state's wealth. But in the very first lecture, I mentioned that the way most countries played mercantilism was you had to have more gold and silver coming in than going out. Mercantilism is based on this idea that there's a finite amount of gold and silver in the world, so you always have to have it coming in and limit the amount going out. That's why I said that whoever has the most gold is going to be in charge. Under a circumstance like that, where you're constantly seeking to accumulate, okay, you don't want national debts. National debts are bad. So if a country has a national debt, that's something that they want to get paid off and get rid of as quickly as possible so they can get back to the business of accumulating. So you can imagine if you double your national debt, that's even more problem for your country. So this debt and this massive area to administer from a colonial standpoint, it's all problematic for Great Britain. Now, when it comes right down to it, Americans have a tendency to treat our history in isolation, that what happened in the United States is unique, it's unique to us, it doesn't affect really anybody else, it's all about quote unquote us. But it's anything but. When we conceive American history, it's always interconnected and intertwined with things that are going on all across the globe. And if we look at the events that lead the United States into being, that lead to the American Revolution, a good place to start is in August of 1765, when, because of that massive national debt, the British government had started implementing a number of taxes, including something called the sugar tax and the Stamp Act tax, which we'll talk about in detail here. But because of those taxes, Americans felt that they were being repressed, and they began to revolt against these taxes. They quite literally burn tax collectors in effigy. They go out and they destroy the offices of these tax collectors as a way of demonstrating we are not going to pay this debt. We're not going to pay off the debt for you. And that tax protest, again, just like the Great Awakening, begins in Boston and spreads downward as far down as South Carolina. And again, while we look at it in this country as the beginning of the American Revolution, and thus that's its only significance, if we look at this as a global process, this mob that's going out and destroying these tax collectors' offices marks the beginning of a 50-year period of revolution and violence in the entirety of the Western world. People across the Western world are taking their cues from what's happening in the American colonies, the place that we're going to be calling the United States in very short order. Now, I'm going to advance the slide, and you're going to see a number of things on this slide. The idea on this next slide is not to get you to memorize every single revolution that's happening across the globe, but just to give you an idea of how widespread, when I say there's the beginning of a 50-year revolutionary period, I want to give you an idea of how widespread that actually is. So if we look at the coming 50 years, we see obviously in 1765, we've got the tax riots in Boston. But in 1768, there's rioting in Geneva, Switzerland, over the equality of rights for all men. And when they say all men, when they say all mankind, they are actually in Geneva. They are thinking in terms of women and men. They are not thinking solely about men in this circumstance. In 1773, we see riots in Russia and we see peasant riots in France as these people are starting to demand that the ruling class take their political interests and their political necessities seriously. In 1776, the same year that the American colonies explode into revolt, we see in Ireland and England, we see riots over multiple issues. We see looting and arson. In Ireland and in England, there's an element of the poor rising up and demanding equality. And then there's also another element in England. There are people who actually support the American Revolution in England. These people who are saying, look, if they don't want to be here, don't make them be part of the British Empire. It's reasonable for them to want to separate. Just let them go. So England has a real crisis on their hand, both abroad and at home. And this means also that England is dealing with this sort of stuff since the 1750s. It's not just the immediacy of the American Revolution. They're dealing with these crises a decade before as well. In 1780, we see Holland and Belgium have their revolutions. In 1789, the French Revolution occurs, and the French Revolution is something that is directly connected to the American Revolution because the French are our allies during the American Revolution, and a lot of the people who were French soldiers who fought become the vanguard of the French Revolution back home. We see revolutions in Poland. We see revolution in Switzerland. And maybe the most interesting revolution of this era is during the French Revolution, a number of slaves in a French colony called Saint-Domingue overthrow their slave owners and create an independent republic of former slaves out of freedmen. And when we talk about the formation of the American political system, we'll talk far more about Saint-Domingue, but it's really one of the more interesting revolutions of the period. In 1796, we have Italy going through a revolution. In 1810, we see revolutions breaking out in modern Mexico and all across what was at that point called the Viceroyalty of New Spain. So we have rioting in 1765 in Boston that touches off something. It's not coincidence. It's not unique to American history. And just to kind of play to those history repeats itself sort of folks, this happens again in 1988 in the Philippines, in China, in Eastern Europe, all across there, and it's spurred on not so much by anything that's happening in the United States, but it's spurred by the breakup and the decay of the former or what was then the Soviet Union. All of those independent states start breaking. The Soviet Union breaks up, and areas start saying, we're not going to be part of a new Russian Federation. We're going to be independent ourselves, and it spurs another revolutionary movement. Now, I've already said that all of these revolutions are connected. They're not connected just because they happen at the same time. I told you, it's not a coincidence that this happens. So there must be something if we take all of these revolutions and then we add the United States' revolution to it. If we take all of these, there has to be something that holds them together, something that intertwines them. And we're going to be looking at those. The things that intertwine these revolutions are ideas. There's something that's going on in the 1770s and 1780s that resonates with lots of people. A lot of times we don't take ideas as seriously as we should. We obviously take money and power very seriously, but sometimes we don't take ideas seriously. But here, ideas are critical because ideas in this case are resonating with literally hundreds of thousands of people in the moment across the globe. Now, all of these revolutions being connected by ideas should make you ask in your head right away, well, what are the ideas? So we're going to talk about what those ideas actually are. The first idea is the idea of nationalism. In this circumstance, what nationalism means is that the people should self-govern. They should not be ruled by empires. So for American colonists, this idea of nationalism meant that people in the American colonies should be in charge of the Americans' fate, not the British Empire. People in Ireland believed the same thing. People in the Viceroyalty of New Spain, in what becomes Mexico, in places like Brazil, in Argentina, they looked at themselves and said, we should be in charge of our future, not this country that's, thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean, Spain. So nationalism, it's a different definition of nationalism than we have today, but nationalism in this context was the idea that people should self-govern and they should not be ruled by empires. The second idea here is the idea of the sovereignty of the people. Now, sovereignty of the people literally means rule by the people. Now, that should sound familiar enough or close to familiar enough. Uh, the idea of we the people. Okay? That's what sovereignty of the people is all about. The people who make up an area make the decisions. They're the ones who decide how we're going to live, what kind of government we're going to have, what kind of protections we're going to have for rights, on and on and on. But the people themselves make the decisions. It's not some set of rulers who dictate these things down, but all of this stuff springs from the people. And then freedom of religion and free enterprise as well play a role in all of this. Now, again, freedom of religion in this context means freedom of religious expression. Okay, so you can worship. The idea of freedom of religion means you can worship God, you can worship Allah, you can worship the spaghetti monster, you can worship a cup of pencils. As long as you are not hurting anybody else, you are free to express your religious beliefs as you see fit. And free enterprise, this takes us back to the idea of mercantilism, that the state determines everything about the economy. The economy is run by the state for the benefit of the nation state. American colonists were saying this is ridiculous. We want to do things from an economic perspective that benefit us individually, not things that benefit England 3,000 miles away. That doesn't matter to us. So freedom of religion and free enterprise play a massive role in all of this. All across the Western world, people embraced these ideas and used them to mobilize for independence, liberty, and freedom. In some places, like the United States, in France, in Saint-Domingue, across Latin America, a lot of people won. The people actually won. But in many other areas, the ruling classes, the elites, the states got in and they put these things down, they repressed them, and they did it with massive amounts of violence. Okay, our next question is, why do these things happen when they do? Most people assume that revolutions occur because the people are poor and oppressed and they've reached a tipping point, that they simply cannot be oppressed any more than they've already been. But there's really not a whole lot of evidence to back up that idea that people reach a tipping point and they just crack and poof, that's actually it. So then, if that's not when they revolt, when do they revolt? Well, a French philosopher who toured the United States and tried to understand what the United States was all about and what their political philosophies were about. This Frenchman was named Alexis de Tocqueville. And Tocqueville actually wrote a very famous book called Democracy in America. And in Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville argued that there's what he called a revolution of rising expectations. He said this revolution of rising expectation is what causes people to revolt. Now, part of this thesis is simple enough. People revolt when they believe that there's a possibility of improvement for their lives. But he says how they believe that that improvement is possible is because things are actually getting better for them, and then something comes along and just slams the door shut. Okay. So, for example, he said if things are always bad, if things are bad and they've always been bad, and there's just constant repression, people in that circumstance have no reason to believe that their lives are somehow going to get better. So they're not going to typically revolt in that circumstance. But if one lives in a totalitarian state and the dictator in that area has been repressing them, and repressing them for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden starts opening society up a little bit. They start allowing a little bit of freedom of assembly. They start allowing a little bit of freedom of speech, and these people take advantage of it. The population takes advantage of that freedom of speech and that freedom of assembly, and at those freedom that using that freedom of assembly, they protest and they demand even greater freedoms and say, you're not doing enough to let us do what we need to do. If that happens and that totalitarian says, okay, enough of this, I'm shutting the door again, I'm closing all of this stuff down, that's when these people will rebel because they've seen what their lives could actually be, and that's what they want. They want more of that. So Alexis de Tocqueville said, it's a revolution of rising expectations. It's not about consistent and constant repression. So, how does this idea of a revolution of rising expectations work in what becomes the United States? Where do we see rising expectations? Well, first, the American colonies were becoming increasingly different from England. They were helping to, this was all helping to create a separate identity for the Americans. Americans were affirming, they were still saying, yes, in fact, we are English citizens. At the start of this revolutionary period, virtually no Americans would go, no, the hell with that, we're not English citizens. They would go, we are English citizens. They might even admit we are English subjects. But they were also saying, we are not like the people in England. We may be subjects, just like people in London, for example, but we are not like them. Our circumstances are different. Now, among the ways it's different, there's no nobility in the Americas. A ruling class, yes, but no nobility. Now, at first, if you remember when I talked about Jamestown in lecture 3 or 4, I don't remember which one, but in lecture, I think it's lecture 4, some nobility did try to come to the Americas, but remember, they weren't here for the long haul. They didn't plan to stay in the Americas. And as it turned out, these noblemen looked at this and said, the Americas are too poor. There's no source of wealth here, really. They're really unhealthy. It's too violent for us, and we don't want to stay, and they wound up leaving. So no real nobility winds up developing in what becomes the United States. Now, an elite absolutely develops. A plantation elite, for example, develops, but it's not something that's like a nobility. There's no titles. They don't pass down hereditarily or anything like that. So no nobility. A second way that these people are saying we're not like England is the idea of self-rule. In order to attract more colonists, the colonies began establishing assemblies, and these assemblies were voted on by the people. Now, it's not true democracy. The only way a person could qualify to vote was by being a white male property owner. But that's still a big difference from what's going on in England. By contrast, there were very few property. The same requirements are the same in England, a white male adult property owner, but very few people actually owned property in England. It's a very small number of people, and there are not a lot of opportunities to own property in England. But think about the Americas. If a person can get to the Americas, they can get to, say, Virginia, and they can live through 5 years in Virginia, they've got a reasonably good shot of owning property. So these people who are now property owners are able to vote, and they are voting on the way they live. Now, the British government, to be clear about this, British government looked at this and said, there is nothing in your charters, there's nothing in our legal system that allows for these colonial assemblies to exist. So on some level, they were saying, you guys don't have this authority to do what you're doing. But most of the prime ministers in England and most of the members of parliament also looked at this and said, while they don't have the authority, on the other hand, it is making the American colonies a viable enterprise. So they took the position that as long as these people, as they engage in this self rule, as long as they don't pass laws that contradict British law, we'll let them do this. Third, I just kind of hinted at this, but there's a wide distribution of property in the Americas. Virtually anybody could own property. You could be a person who was on that original vessel that came to Jamestown. You could be descendants of those people. You could be an indentured servant and live through your term of indenture and get land that way. If you didn't get land through your freedom dues, once colonists start pushing westward and conquer various areas, what they allow for is for people to quote stake land claims, and all this means, it's really simple. As you go out, you have all these people who go out and they rush out to this property and they put out stakes. That's why it's called staking a claim. They put out stakes saying, this is the area that I'm going to make my property. And as long as you improve that property, like build a house or build a well or build a fence or plant crops, as long as you quote improve that property, it's yours. You're going to get taxed on it, which is normal, but it's your property. So there's not a real cost to it. Even places that where there were quote unquote publicly owned land that would be sold for speculation, the prices of that land were really cheap, because if you think about the population density, people looked at the amount of land out there and said, there's more land than we'll ever use. So property values were actually very, very low. So this allowed for a wide distribution of property, much, much more widely distributed than there is back home in England. And then our last difference is the colonies contained religious diversity. Now, again, we're not going to overplay this point. This religious diversity is overwhelmingly Christian in orientation. But even within the Christian church, there are a number of denominations. There's a number of different sects. And if you think about what's back home in England, we've mentioned this before, there's the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and that's it. That's the only legal body of religious expression. But here in the Americas, in the colonies, you've got the Anglican Church, you've got offshoots of the Anglican Church like the Presbyterian Church and the Congregationalist Church. You've got the Quaker movement. There are Methodists, there's Baptists, there's all sorts of different groups. There's Catholic groups in places like Baltimore or in Maryland. Maryland is set up specifically as a Catholic colony. There's the permission of to be atheist in the colonies. There's no requirement that you join a church. There are a fair number of Muslim families in places like Charleston, South Carolina. There's a fair number of Muslim and Jewish families in the colony of New York, dating back to when the Dutch controlled New York. They didn't care about religion. So they said anybody who wants to come, irrespective of religion, is welcome here. So the American colonies had far more religious diversity than their mother country, England, did. So all of these things combined meant that the English here in the Americas, the American colonists, saw themselves as different. They were distinct from their English counterparts back home. They were also different from English colonists elsewhere. They would look at English colonists in Ireland, for example, or in Scotland, and say, yeah, we're all colonists, but we've got nothing. We're not like you guys. We have nothing in common with you. We're literally all just colonists. That's the only thing we have in common. So that's one way we can see this idea of rising expectations. Another way that we can see it is in a series of events that begins occurring in 1763, right after the end of the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. This series of events that occurs convinces Americans that they needed to revolt. Now, I'm using that word, they need to revolt. I'm using that specifically. They need to revolt. Not that they should revolt. Not that, well, we've got to get together and discuss whether it might be a good idea. But ultimately, Americans conclude they must revolt from English authority. They must separate from England. Now, in history, just like in the modern world, in quote, real life, if you will, often what is actually happening is less important than how people interpret what is happening. So it's critically important when I say that this series of events occurred after 1763, etc. It's important to understand what colonists believed was happening. In addition to what was actually happening, it's important to understand what colonists believed was happening. And here is what they believed. They believed that between 1763 and 1775, England was plotting to enslave them, to reduce them to slavery. Now, those are the words that these people use over and over and over again. There is no evidence whatsoever to support the idea that Great Britain was going to, quote, enslave the Americas. But think about, again, in a previous lecture, how we defined the difference between slavery and liberty. If somebody doesn't have liberty, they're by definition a slave. And what decides, or what marks liberty, what defines liberty, is the ability to own property. So if the English do anything to deprive these people of property, these people are going to see that in terms of they're trying to enslave us. And that property, it can be real estate, it can be money, it can be the ability to earn a living, it can be the ability to make decisions for yourself. All of those things stem from the ability to own property. So if you're taking these things away, if you're saying you're not allowed to make your decisions for yourself, the only group of people in the world who don't make decisions in their own lives are enslaved people. So when these colonists are saying England is threatening to reduce us to slavery, it's not that they believe that quite literally England is coming over and going to put shackles on them and drag them off to a sugar plantation like they did the Irish in the 1600s. It's not that. It's that they believe that their liberty is at stake, which is why I went into such detail about how we define liberty and how we define slavery. So, how do we see this particular conspiracy playing out in all of this stuff? How are the British convincing them, quote unquote, that they are trying to enslave them? Well, the first way is through something called the Proclamation of 1763. Now, this proclamation of 1763 happened almost immediately after the 7 Years' War was over. In 1763, Great Britain wins the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War. As I mentioned earlier, France surrenders all of their territory in North America, so Great Britain controls virtually everything east of the Mississippi River, literally doubling their administrative control. Basically, they control everything except Florida, and you can see these areas of eastern Alabama and Mississippi that they don't that they do control, but are not under the Indian Reserve part. So basically, everything but Florida. Okay, the British control all of this. Now, as soon as that happens, once they're in control of all of this stuff, one of the first things Great Britain does is they establish this proclamation of 1763 that creates a line essentially across the Appalachian Mountains. You can see it represented by the red line on this map. And what the Proclamation of 1763 states is that we're going to have this line across the Appalachian Mountains that establishes a westward point beyond which colonists may not settle. Now, not only they may not settle, look at what the area directly west of that red line is. It's the area called the Indian Reserve. The Indian Reserve. Now, this explains why the British were saying, we're going to establish this line and you can't settle beyond this. The one thing the British did not want to happen, they looked at the colonists and they said, the colonists are always pushing westward, always wanting more land, and the Indians live out there, and if these colonists try to go west, they're going to wind up in a conflict with the Indians. And the one thing the British knew was Americans don't do so well fighting Indians. So what's going to happen is the British will wind up having to get called in to fix things. They'll have to come in with the British Army and fight the Indians and put the whole thing down and save the Americans. And given that they already had a doubled national debt and wars are expensive, they said, we've got to make sure we don't wind up getting into any more costly wars with these Native Americans west of the Proclamation line. So this is why they're doing it. Okay. Now, the colonists saw this as an effort to wall them in, to say, you guys are restricted to only this area. Okay. You're not going to be allowed to go out and try to own land beyond that area. So Americans saw this as a restriction on, quote, their liberties. But that's only one part of this. The British also left 10,000 troops in the Americas, in the United States, in what becomes the United States. They left 10,000 of their troops here after the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War in order to enforce that line. And quite literally, those 10,000 soldiers' jobs, if Americans go beyond that line, if they try to establish settlements, the British Army's job is to go out to those settlements and evict the Americans, get them out of those areas. And the British take a fair amount of pleasure in doing this. They go out, they evict American colonists and settlers, and then they also frequently burn down the houses and stuff so that these people cannot return. So Americans look at this and they're furious about the whole thing. Now, Britain also passes something in this moment called the Quartering Act. They pass this as a parallel to the Proclamation of 1763. And this Quartering Act required the colonists to actually pay for those 10,000 troops that were left here. And the British, again, from the British perspective, it was reasonable to do this. They looked at it and said, the 10,000 troops would not be left here to enforce this if you guys would just obey the rules. The only reason they're here is because of you. And since we have this doubled national debt, we can't pay for everything. If they're here because of you, you are going to pay for it. Now, Americans looked at that and they were angry. Not only have they been walled in, not only have they been surrounded, but they've had these soldiers left in their midst, and the soldiers are going to push them down. They're going to repress them. And on top of that, they're being asked to pay for the privilege. That's how Americans see it. So there's a fundamental disagreement in how all of this works. There's a fundamental perception gap, if you will. Step number 2 in this conspiracy. In 1765, Britain passed the so-called Stamp Act. Again, the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War were incredibly expensive. Great Britain's national debt literally doubled over the course of those two wars. Now, they have to pay the debt off, and they've got to pay troops, and they've got to pay for services, and all of these other things associated with governance. So Great Britain's idea for funding all of this was a stamp tax. All documents, all paper, all legal proceedings, playing cards, all sorts of things had to have a stamp affixed to them showing that the government's tax had been paid. So, for example, if a person has a sheaf of papers, they would be required, if they were buying that paper and they wanted to take it out with them, they'd have to pay for it, but then they'd also have to go to a stamp window, or a tax window, excuse me, where the tax collector would stamp individually each one of the pieces of paper and then say, okay, here's how much you owe me. And if you can't pay it, you don't get the paper. Now, it's one thing if it's something like a newspaper where you can go, I've got to pay a tax on this. The hell with that. I don't care. I'm not doing it. But if it's a legal proceeding, if it's something that says, for example, you're buying a farm from somebody or you're buying a business from somebody, it's an absolute necessity to have those papers. It's not optional anymore. So they're being taxed on this, and they're furious about it. Americans are angry about this. Now, in part, they're angry because their taxes were already ridiculously low. They were far lower than anyone else's taxes in the entirety of the British Empire. These people only, at this point, they only paid what are called customs dues or customs duties. These are taxes on imported goods. But, think about any imported goods that you guys buy. For example, if any of you buy a cell phone, that cell phone, I would suggest in 99.5% of the cases, is manufactured outside of the United States. But when you buy it, you don't see retail price, sales tax, import tax, and then total. You simply see the price and the sales tax, because the import tax that the person selling it to you or the distributor selling that distributor has already paid the import tax and figured that into the price of the thing they're selling you. So you don't pay it directly. So when Americans thought about taxes, their thought was, we don't pay taxes. We don't have any taxes. And again, these people pay lower taxes than anybody else in the British Empire. However, this is a direct tax. And as soon as the British announced this, the Americans are furious. They're angry that Britain has the audacity to make them pay a direct tax, meaning you have to go to the taxpayer and pay it. They're also convinced that the British had done this without a reasonable authority. They were convinced that the British Parliament had done this to them, and Americans, because they don't have a representative in Parliament, were being repressed. This was being placed upon them as opposed to them agreeing to the necessity. So you've got a conflict over simply the tax itself, plus the question for many Americans, do the British have the actual authority to tax us? And you can probably figure out that the British government said, of course we have the authority to tax you. But in any event, the stamp tax convinced colonists that the British are out to tax them to death. Step number 3 is the enforcement of those actual customs duties, those import taxes. Now, Americans were supposed to be paying these all along, but most American shippers were actually engaging in smuggling. And the reason they're doing this is because if you mentally put that picture of the map up again, the Atlantic coastline is an incredibly long coastline in the colonies. There is no way the British can actually cover every single square inch of coastline. So smuggling was not that difficult. And also, Great Britain had actually, up until the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War, they had concluded that because we've got all of this trade, there's going to be some smuggling. That's just the way it works. It's, quote, what we today would call it is it's the cost of doing business. So the British said, we're not going to enforce these trade regulations. We're not going to enforce smuggling laws, because some smuggling means that we've got a lot of good, legitimate trade. So the British were practicing what becomes known as salutary neglect. Lax enforcement of British trade laws would actually stimulate legitimate trade. So they're not worried about this. But the problem here is that's the way things have been going all along in the colonies. However, in 1763, again, England has a doubled national debt. They have far more expenses because of a doubled area that they have to administer from a colonial standpoint. And they say, we can't just turn a blind eye to smuggling anymore. We can't afford to let that revenue go. So, what they do is they start setting up courts that are called admiralty courts all across the coastline, and they empower the British Navy to actually stop vessels, search those vessels, and if they are carrying smuggled cargo, they are allowed to bring those ships into the Admiralty courts, and the Admiralty courts have the power to not only seize the cargo, but to seize the vessel as well. So you can take this ship captain's livelihood and the sailors, you can take their livelihood away from them if the smuggling is too great. So people look at this, and again, they are furious. They are angry that this has actually happened, and they demand a stop to it. And what's on some level kind of crazy about this whole thing with this idea that there's a conspiracy theory that Americans are buying into at this point. What's crazy about it is that Americans protest every single one of these things. They demand that the British rescind the Proclamation of 1763, and they do. They demand that the British rescind the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, and they do. They demand that they rescind these laws about smuggling, and the British do. In every single case, the colonists rebel and the British back down. But starting at the heading toward the end of the 1760s, there's going to be even greater fights among the colonists. And this is because a new prime minister and a new chancellor of the exchequer, which is basically the secretary of the treasury. These two new authorities come in, and they believe that they can fix the British economy, but they make it very plain. Taxes are going to be a part of this. You Americans are not going to be able to avoid paying taxes. You're just going to have to accept that you're British subjects, and as British subjects, you are required to pay certain taxes. Now, those taxes came to be known as the so-called Townshend duties. The Townshend duties. A duty is a tax. So the Townshend duties are these taxes that are levied on paint, on paper, on lead glass, and on tea. Now, Americans hated these taxes, as they hate all taxes. They hated these taxes, and it's because of the Townshend duties that Americans start screaming about no taxation without representation. This idea of no taxation without representation, we talked about it a couple of minutes ago. The American colonists feel they do not have an actual representative in Parliament, therefore, it's unreasonable for Parliament to tax them. So they're angry about it in that regard. But they're also angry about this because these Townshend duties are kind of the way that mercantilism works. All of these things were manufactured, or in the case of tea, they were grown outside of North America, and they were forcing Americans to buy these goods from those outside sources. But Americans were rationalizing, we can make these things. We can make paint. We can manufacture paper and lead glass. We can grow tea here in the Americas, and these goods would be cheaper. Why do we have to buy them from these outside sources? And the British government, their answer was, because this is the way the economy works. You have to buy what we tell you. Because remember, it's a state-oriented system of control. Mercantilism is. All economic activities are managed by the state for the benefit of the state, not the benefit of these individual consumers. So you've got two reasons why Americans are angry. We're going to add a third reason to this. The third reason is that Townshend, the prime minister, stated that these taxes are going to be used to pay for the salaries of the royal colonial officials. Every colony in North America had at least a governor and a lieutenant governor who were British officials. They were not chosen, quote unquote, by the colonists themselves. These people were answerable to the King of England and Parliament. So, since they're royal officials, they're getting a royal salary. Now, the way this had always worked from the moment the colonies were created, the colonial assemblies would appropriate money and then they would pay for these royal officials. So, in reality, it's the same sort of thing. It's their tax money that's going to pay these salaries, so they're still paying for it. But it's about who's in control and who's writing the check. When the colonists, when their representatives are getting together and appropriating money and paying these officials, the colonists feel that they are in control, that these officials are beholden to them, that they do what we tell them to do, that they hold the power of the purse string. So they are in charge. The colonists are in charge. Now that the taxes will be collected by the royal government, and then the royal government will pay all of these officials, these colonists believe that that power has been ripped from them and put in the hands of royal officials now. So Americans hate these towns and duties. They hate them because they're taxes. They hate them because of the way mercantilism works. And they hate them because of the way they seem to have lost control. And just like they always did, American colonists got angry and they revolted on them, on all of this stuff. And once again, Great Britain backed down. They backed down to an extent, though. First thing is they don't back down on the tax on tea. They say we're backing down. We're gonna get rid of all of these other taxes, but we're going to continue the tax on tea. More on that in just a second. But the other thing that they did was the Parliament issued a proclamation stating and affirming that they do have the power to make laws that govern the Americas. They said it's really great that you guys think that these colonial assemblies are so important, but the authority here is Parliament, not you guys. And when Americans argued that, well, we don't have any representation, Britain's answer to that is that every single citizen in the British Empire is represented by every member of the British Parliament. So it doesn't matter if you live in Charleston, South Carolina, if you live in Dublin, Ireland, or Glasgow, Scotland, or some suburb of London. You are represented and your interests are represented by every member of Parliament. Great Britain called this virtual representation, but they argued that just by the sense of virtual representation, you are actually represented in Congress. Now, Americans hated this idea, but they didn't continue the fight on this, with the exception again on tea. Now, why tea became such an issue here is the East India Tea Company had this massive inventory of tea and they were going bankrupt. And Britain decided, because Britain's royal family was invested in the East India Tea Company, they had an idea. We'll create a monopoly for the East India Tea Company in the Americas. And they didn't quite literally say the only tea you can buy is East India Tea Company tea. But what they did was they taxed every other tea to such an extent that it was very obviously cheaper to buy East India Tea Company's product. But Americans continually refused to do this. Americans understood that all of these other teas were more expensive, but they basically were saying, we don't care. We're not going to let you tell us what tea to drink on top of all of this. And when Great Britain continually refused to back down on that tax, this is when a number of Bostonians got together in a group called the Sons of Liberty. They got together, allegedly they painted themselves dark with cork so that they would appear as if they were Native Americans. And at night, they got on these vessels of the East India Tea Company and dumped all of the tea into the Boston Harbor, resulting in the famous Boston Tea Party. Now, when this happens, Great Britain is furious. This is when Great Britain goes, okay, damn it, that's enough of you Americans. Great Britain immediately, their parliament immediately starts passing a series of new laws that are collectively known as the Intolerable Acts. Now, we're not going to go into all of them. The two that are the most important that I want you to remember are the Boston Port Act and the Massachusetts Government Act. The Boston Port Act is about collecting revenue for the East India Tea Company. All of that tea had been dumped in Boston Harbor. It meant that the money was gone. So the Boston port is turned over to British officials who will collect revenue on behalf of the East India Tea Company. So anything that's coming through the port of Boston, a little piece of it is going to be taken away and given to the East India Tea Company to fund them for their losses. The other part is the Massachusetts Government Act. The Massachusetts Government Act specifically dissolved the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly. And the reason for this is very simple. Parliament's answer for why did you pass this act? Why are you taking away the Massachusetts government or the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly? They believed that the Massachusetts Parliament and the local leadership had not done enough to put down the Sons of Liberty and to stop all of this rabble rousing. So they said, since you can't handle government, you don't have a government anymore. Now, this has a broad effect. This Massachusetts Government Act has a broad effect. If you remember when I talked about things like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act and all of these other protests, I mentioned that it starts in Boston, but it spreads southward. So far, Massachusetts has been the only colonial assembly that's been disbanded. They're the only colony that's being smacked down like this. But other colonies know we are protesting in exactly the same way that Massachusetts is. So if the British can come in and shut down their colonial assembly, what's to stop them from ours? So other colonies are starting to get as resolute, as radicalized as people in Massachusetts. On some level, the final straw for these people was the so-called Quebec Act of 1775 or 1774. In this Quebec Act, it's almost a redo of the Proclamation of 1763. In the Quebec Act, Boston once again tried to restrict access to the West. They drew that line and said everything west of the Appalachians is off limits to American colonists, but it added to it that it was, quote, forever guaranteed, end quote, to Indians who lived in that area and to the French residents who had remained. Now, these people were French people who were now under the authority of the British government. And these French settlers believed that someday British settlers might be unleashed on them and they'd be killed. So the Quebec Act was a way of, on some level, telling the French, look, you're safe. You don't have to worry about this. But Americans are furious about all of this stuff. And on top of that, they're angry when the Quebec Act also states that the French would be allowed to practice Catholicism without interference. Now, why Americans are so angry about this Quebec Act and even the Proclamation of 1763, why they see this as a violation of their liberty, is very simple. There is a ton of land out there in the West. Land, remember, defines liberty. And these people are looking at this and saying, in the French and Indian War, they fought. We fought. We were on the British side. We were on the winning side. We fought. We bled. Some of our relatives died in that war. And now we're being told we can't even reap the benefits of this. And worse yet, the people we defeated are going to be able to reap the benefits. Unacceptable. So Americans become infuriated over this Quebec Act and began demanding that the Parliament actually do something about this. So Americans are convinced they are being enslaved here. Now, the signers of the Declaration of Independence, when they get together and they meet at the Continental Congress and ultimately draft the Declaration of Independence. All of the men who signed it had every reason in the world to fear for their lives. In Ireland, during this same period, we've already mentioned this, a rebellion was breaking out in Ireland, and Britain responded by hanging a lot of the leaders of this Irish rebellion. But some of you, I'm sure, if you've seen movies, you've heard the phrase "hanged until dead." You might have wondered, well, why did they say hanged until dead? Because you don't die immediately in a hanging if it's done properly. And what the British decided to do was use hanging as torture here. They hanged a lot of these Irish people, but only until they were severely injured. Like, their neck might snap and they'd be paralyzed, but they weren't dead yet. Or they would be severely injured, but they might not be paralyzed. So a fair amount of pain would still be on the way for them. But the point is, they hang these people until they are injured. Then, while they're still alive, they disembowel them. They will then stretch them. They decapitate them. They quarter them. And eventually, when all is said and done, they burn the bodies, all as a warning to other people in Ireland that if you do this, if you rebel against England, this is your fate. So the guys who signed this Declaration of Independence, they're not dumb. They are very well informed. They are aware of this. So they know they're taking their lives into their hands when they write and sign the Declaration of Independence. Now, this Revolutionary War that the United States engages in is the first modern revolution. And the Declaration of Independence lays out what they're fighting for in this revolution. So the Declaration of Independence is a critical document. It lays out not only why we're fighting, it lays out a series of grievances. It says, these are things that you guys have done that are wrong. Okay, people in the United States were fighting for a series of universal human rights that are spelled out in the Declaration of Independence in ways that are more important than this idea of all are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There are broader universal rights that are laid out and spelled out in the Declaration of Independence. One of the things that Thomas Jefferson wrote into the Declaration of Independence was that government must be representative. Now, when you see representative government, don't think in terms of, well, there has to be a representation from here, a representative from here, and everybody gets whatever. It's about representative of the people's will. Okay? The government must benefit the governed. And what Jefferson wrote in this document to the ends of representative government was, if a government does not actually represent the will of the people, if it doesn't represent their moral standards or their political standards or whatever, pick something. If that government ceases to represent the people, it is legitimate for the people to overthrow that government. So take this and apply it specifically here. What Jefferson and the rest of the founders at that Continental Congress were saying was that Great Britain is not doing what is in keeping with American ideals. Americans are different. These are our ideals. They are different from yours. You no longer are representative of us. So it is legitimate for us to separate. It is legitimate for us to leave the British Empire. Secondly, the idea of equality before the law, that every single person within a society, any person who has liberty, has the exact same rights before the law as compared to anyone else. There is no separate class of laws for one group of people and another set of laws for another group of people. It's the same set of laws for everybody. And these people believed that the British were not living up to those standards. The idea of natural rights is spelled out here. Now, not what a natural right is. The idea of natural rights is you don't have to have them spelled out because everybody theoretically knows what those are. But what Jefferson and the founders are talking about here within the idea of natural rights is that the government must acknowledge that these fundamental rights exist and that they exist for everybody. And the government must also spell out in a written document precisely that these rights will be respected, that these rights will be protected. And again, this is in contrast to the English system where these colonists believe that the British government has not actually acted in a way to protect these people's natural rights. They have violated these people's natural rights. So they're saying, we're going to form a new government and we're going to do it this way. The idea of a distinct identity continues to go through the Declaration of Independence. We've already covered it, so I'm not going to beat that to death. But again, this notion that Americans are not like the British and they're not like other colonists elsewhere. And then there are also a series of genuine grievances laid out, which when you read the Declaration of Independence, you should note that these people, as much as I've said they were being a little bit paranoid, they're creating this conspiracy theory. And while that's true, Parliament had, in fact, passed laws that restricted westward mobility. This was something without precedent. There was never other areas within the British Empire that applied like this. They had placed new taxes on these colonists. Parliament also persisted with keeping soldiers in their midst in what they were defining as quote unquote peacetime. The Parliament infringed on trial by jury. They restricted the meetings of colonial assemblies. And then, even in the final insult, the Parliament passed a law that required that private citizens use spare bedrooms in their homes to put soldiers up in the Americas. So, as Americans are seeing it, all of these rights are being taken away, and it's legitimate for us to argue that you cannot do this. So while these people, I said this earlier, while these people may be a little bit paranoid, it doesn't mean that they're always wrong either. They certainly had a point in all of this, that they were being wrong. So on April 18th, 1775, the Revolutionary War begins in earnest. Now, I'm sure some of you have heard that that's not true, that the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, and that's the beginning of the Revolutionary War. But for the Revolutionary War to get to that point where a Declaration of Independence was even considered, we have to move back a little bit and look at April of 1775, when the British sent out just over a battalion of soldiers to search for weapons that the colonists had stockpiled in Concord, Massachusetts. Now, they knew that these rebels, they had good intelligence, the British did. They had good intelligence. They knew who the leaders of the rebellion were. They knew what businesses they were involved in. They had arrested several of them and impounded cargoes that were smuggled cargoes. So they had really good knowledge that these people had stockpiled weapons, where they did it, and how they did it, and all of this sort of stuff. So they sent these soldiers. They sent more than 900 troops out to recover and destroy these weapons. Now, the troops stopped first. The British soldiers stopped first at a place called Lexington Green. And at that Lexington Green, the first shots of the Revolutionary War are fired. They wind up meeting a contingent of a group of militia that were called Minutemen, who kind of delayed the ability of these guys to leave Lexington. The soldiers did in fact push through, and they made it out to Concord. And once again in Concord, they were met by these colonial militias called Minutemen. When not only are shots fired, the British looked at this as a successful raid, even though we're going to explain why Americans looked at it as a successful action here as well. At Concord, the British did find a fair amount of goods. They found cannons, they found flour, they found a lot of food that was bound for these soldiers. And they destroyed all of that stuff. So they believed that they had put a real dent in the American ability to fight a revolution. So that's why the British look at it as a victory. Americans look at it as a victory because when the British leave Concord, American Minutemen actually follow them out of Concord. And as they march back to Boston, the colonists just take these shots at them, which several historians refer to as pot shots. It's not really pot shotting, but they go after these British soldiers. And in the process, the British suffer 180 casualties. That is more than 1 out of every 5. Any military leader will tell you a 20% casualty rate is very high. It's not something that you actually want. You want to get that casualty number down. So the British are call it a victory, but they're upset because so many soldiers have been attacked and wounded, and so many are wounded that Americans can call it a victory. So, what's the difference? Why do we have these two dates, July 4th on the one hand, April 18th, 1775 on the other hand? The reason is very simple. A lot of colonists actually truly believed in April of 1775 that there was not going to be a conflict, that just like always, the Americans would stand up and say, "You can't do that." And Britain would go, "All right, you're right. We're not going to do it. What can we do differently to make sure that we're getting taxes, that we're getting revenue, and all this stuff?" They truly believed if they stood up, Britain would back down. So that's part of this. The only people who are actually radicalized are the people in places like Lexington and Concord who do not believe that there will at some point be a negotiated settlement. They conclude the time for negotiations is over with and we need to fight now. So in April 18, 1775, not very many people are radicals and buying into the idea of we've got to go to war with Great Britain. But by July of 1776, more and more people had come around to the idea that, yeah, war is actually necessary. Thus, they get together and order Thomas Jefferson and his aides to prepare the Declaration of Independence. Now, in this particular war, it's a very strange war. It's a war that has a lot of similarities and confluences with other conflicts that the United States has had. One obvious difference, though, that I want to point out is that the United States is in an unusual position for our history. The United States is in the position of the underdog here. The British are the clear global superpower at this moment, while the Americans, they're the insurgents. They're the ones who are hanging on by a thread. They're the ones who are going to be required to take the pot shots, for lack of a better way of putting it, because they know they can't match what the British have. So that's one thing that's actually different. If we look at these other wars, though, 1% of the population, of the total population of the United States, died during the Revolution. Now, 1% doesn't sound very much. It's hard to kind of conceptualize what 1% actually is. But think about today in the modern world. If we had some sort of a circumstance, be it war or whatever, where 1% of our population was going to die. Okay? In our current society, that 1% would be about 3 million people. I assure you, there's nothing that could happen where people would go 3 million. That's okay. That's on the low side anyway. So the amount of death that happens during the American Revolution, this 1%, is really, really high. With the exception of the Civil War, the American Civil War of the 1860s, this is the United States' bloodiest war in history relative to population, and it's also the longest war the United States is involved in until the Vietnam War in the 20th century. We see brutal reprisals on both sides of this fight, including the murders of those who supported Great Britain by colonists, the British Army themselves supported people or supported themselves through a process called foraging, meaning they would go through the countryside and they'd simply take whatever they needed from people. Now, all of this stuff that's happening is particularly bad in places like Connecticut and New Jersey. In both Connecticut and in New Jersey, both Continental Army officers and British Army officers found it difficult to discipline their own troops. There were lots of straight out murders in these circumstances. The American Continental Army documented dozens of rapes and attempted rapes on both sides. So neither side was particularly good on this front. And while it's probably true that the British did the most damage, it's also true that American soldiers engaged in foraging as well. They would go through the countryside and say, hey, we need that cart, we're taking it. We need those horses, we're taking them. We need that corn, we're taking it. The difference is that George Washington was very much aware of how bad this actually looked. So when he would say to his men, yes, foraging is acceptable, I'll allow you to do it, he also said, we'll allow you to do it on one condition. You've got to give the equivalent of an IOU to the farmer. That way the farmer does not feel as if he's being taken advantage of. This war also created widowhood on an unprecedented scale. Now, I've referenced this in a previous lecture, but women do not have an actual legal standing during this era. There's a term we're going to return to in a couple of weeks here, or in a couple of classes, called couverture. Women operated under the laws of a system called couverture during this era, which meant that legally speaking, women were an extension of their male guardian. So if they don't have a father, it is absolutely, if their father had passed away, for example, it's imperative that they get married. That way they have a guardian who can look after them. Otherwise, women are considered to be orphaned at that point. So the fact that we've got this massive widow problem means that there are going to be a lot of women in the United States who are going to be pushed even further and further to the margins of American society. There's also a massive refugee problem in the United States as a consequence of this Revolutionary War. Starting with Boston, Boston wound up being occupied by the British forces almost from day one. And because of that, the population in Boston declined almost overnight from 15,000 to 5,000. Now, by contrast, New York saw their population increase by approximately 500%, creating massive food shortages and housing shortages, and also a massive sanitation problem in New York as well. And to kind of contextualize this, a population increase of 500%, just to take the city I live in, Houston, Texas. Houston, Texas is give or take about 4 million people in the metropolitan area. A 500% increase in the population would mean that the city of Houston would go from 4 million people to 20 million people. And in this case, we've used the term overnight. So in a very short period, if a city like Houston went from 4 million people to 20 million people, Houston would be absolutely crippled by something like that. So this is not a small problem. This is a massive problem that these cities are having to undertake. Now, we live with the benefit of 240 years worth of hindsight to tell us that the Americans won this war. But it was not at all inevitable that the United States was going to win the Revolutionary War. If we looked at a sort of tail of the tape, so to speak, anybody who had an ounce of sense in 1774 or 5 or 6 would look at this and say, the Americans, at minimum, have a tough road to climb, or a tough hill to climb here. If they were being honest, they would look at it and say, Great Britain has a clear advantage, and there's very little chance that the Americans could win. For example, Great Britain had a professional army of 50,000 troops. Now, what I mean by a professional army is it's more than just these people get paid for this. It means That's their job. Being a soldier is their profession. So everything they do is about being a soldier. When they get up in the morning, they don't have a choice of, well, should I go and work the farm first, or should I report for duty at the town square for drilling? These people, their job is drilling and preparing for how to be a better soldier in combat. Okay, so the opposite of this, the opposite of professional soldiers, is militia forces, forces that are largely volunteer, that are not really getting paid, or if they are, they're getting paid a pittance, and they have a choice about, well, I'm going to go and work my fields today because I haven't been tending my fields because I've been drilling all of this time. So Great Britain has 50,000 professional troops, while the Germans have loaned them 30,000 mercenaries. Various German principalities, like Hesse, have loaned the British 30,000 more soldiers. So Britain has at their disposal 80,000 soldiers who are professional soldiers. Their job, their reason for being, is to be a soldier. Now, the Continental Congress authorized George Washington a force of 20,000 men. They said, we will allow the Continental Army to recruit up to 20,000 men. But they also made it clear, the Congress did, that those 20,000 men would be divided amongst 4 commands. So when we say that George Washington had 20,000 men, technically yes, because he was the commander-in-chief of all U.S. military forces. Technically, yes, but under his direct control, he never had anywhere close to that when it came to the actual Revolutionary War. Now, among this population that made up the soldiery in the United States, and it is proper to call it the United States now, those troops were incredibly young, ranging from their teens to their mid-20s for the most part. Historians have found a number of enlistments of 12 and 13-year-olds in the Continental Army. So when I say young teenagers fighting in this war, they absolutely are. So we've got this incredibly small number. We've got an incredibly young soldiery. They are poor. They're unskilled and landless. So there are people at the very bottom levels of society fighting for something that they really don't have. They're saying, we're fighting to preserve liberty, but they don't own land. So it's a very strange type of group that's fighting for the liberty of all of these other landholders. The lowest levels, including slaves, were actually allowed ultimately to enlist in the Continental Army. Now, many women also served the Continental Army. They served in auxiliary roles by serving as nurses. They served as cooks, as maids for the encampments. Many of them also would join in if they were bringing water up to the front to the cannons, for example, and a cannoneer got shot. A lot of these women would step in for that cannoneer and finish the bombardment, at least until more men could be brought up. But there's also dozens of cases of women who dressed and passed themselves as men so that they could actually fight in the Continental Army on equal footing. So when we think of this Continental Army, is it a professional army? Yeah, they're paid to be there. They are quote-unquote professionals. But there's a wide gulf between the British professionals and the American professionals. So victory here was not at all a given. And yet, the Americans actually do win this war. So how do they actually defeat this superpower in Great Britain? Well, one way they do it is the British find that conquering the colonies was nearly impossible from a geographic and a geopolitical scale. One thing that the British had to contend with is that the American colonies combined were larger than virtually than all of Western Europe combined. And that even the British were not arrogant enough to believe that they could actually go out and conquer all of Western Europe. They just didn't believe that. So conquering the colonies was not likely. But the British also understood that in order to win a victory, they absolutely had to conquer these people. They couldn't just defeat them in victory, they had to conquer them. They had to beat them to remove that revolutionary fervor. If they don't actually do that, then all they're doing is just putting off the inevitable. So, from a geographical standpoint, conquering the colonies is an impractical thing. But it's also, from a geopolitical standpoint, practically impossible. The other countries in Europe had important conquerable cities where if you conquer that city, you destroy that country. In the Americas, however, in the United States, they don't have that same thing. Does the United States have important cities? Of course they do. We've got, at this moment, there's New York, there's Philadelphia, there's Pittsburgh, there's Baltimore, there's Charleston, Boston is part of this. All of these are critically important cities. But listen to this. The British controlled, at various points, every single one of those cities. And they still could not force the Americans to surrender. It simply did not work. Britain could control all of these cities, but they had no ability to actually control the countryside where the bulk of the revolutionary fervor was, and where there were a significant amount of loyalists, so they couldn't protect those loyalists either. Now, this also plays into the second reason why the American colonists were able to win here. The British had a lot of loyalists in the American colonies, and they simply did not take advantage of it. At least 1/3 of the colonial population were actually loyalists. And what I mean by that, think about what the mindsets of these various Americans were. There were Americans who were saying, we are British subjects, but the British have done us wrong, so it is legitimate to overthrow them, and by God, that's exactly what we're going to do. There were a number of colonists who said, we are British subjects, we should rebel, but maybe the British will make everything right. And then there's another group that says, we are British subjects, the British have the right to rule us, we have an obligation to conform to the law, and my obligation, my loyalty resides with Great Britain. So they are completely counter-revolutionary, if you will. There's at least 1/3 of the population fit into this loyalist ideology. And indeed, 50,000 of them formed a militia and offered their services to the British government. And here is where it becomes problematic. Americans, I told you, had already come to this conclusion that, quote, we have a distinct identity from our British counterparts. Well, the British also had begun to believe that. When these 50,000 loyalists say, hey, we're here, we want to fight for the motherland, the British look at them kind of like, you guys are Americans. I don't think we can trust you guys. So they never actually utilize that 50,000 man militia. Now think about how the numbers would work here. If George Washington has an authorized army of 20,000, and to be clear on this, that's not just the totality of his forces. He's got thousands of militia soldiers at his disposal too. But think about what the British would have at their disposal. 50,000 professionals, 50,000 loyalists in a militia, which would be far more than what Washington had, and 30,000 of those mercenaries from Hesse. That would be an overwhelming numerical superiority. This would give them the numerical ability, anyway, to crush these American colonists like they needed to do. But because they didn't trust these loyalists, because they said, you guys are Americans just like these revolutionaries, said, we don't want to use you, they squandered an opportunity. A third thing that caused American victory, or helped lead to American victory, was guerrilla warfare. During their various Indian wars, the colonists had learned to use certain tactics, to adapt certain tactics that they had learned from those fights. So they learned the idea of quick strikes and taking advantage of when they have numerical superiority, and taking advantage of the terrain, for example, like lurking behind trees or using valleys to their advantage. They also did things in guerrilla warfare, like they didn't wear traditional uniforms. They'd wear civilian clothing when they fought, so that they could blend back in with local populations. If they carried out a hit and run attack and ran back to a village, there's no uniform to search for. They can't. They don't. They look just like everybody else in the village. So all of these things uh, uh, are part of that idea of guerrilla warfare. And the British really don't have a counter for this. The British, first of all, are not even schooled in this type of fighting. They're schooled in what's called linear warfare. You take a line of soldiers, you take soldiers, you line them up, and you advance them across the battlefield. So that line of soldiers that might start at point A, if they're going to get to point B, which is down here, that whole line is going to march in very close order and pivot and make it down to point B. But that requires a lot of order and a lot of discipline, and it's not something tactically that works very well against an enemy that is engaged in guerrilla warfare. And on top of that, the British, their army wears this bright red tunic as part of their uniform. So they stand out like a sore thumb. They're easy to spot at all times. So guerrilla warfare is a problem for the British. A fourth thing is foreign support. This foreign support came from France, Spain, and Holland, and it makes a huge difference in the Revolutionary War. Now, to be clear about this foreign support, I do not want to give you the wrong impression. Spain, France, and Holland did not look at this Revolutionary War and go, by God, it's a great idea to have this idea that you overthrow the government if it ceases to represent your interests. And natural rights, oh, how did we miss that? Of course we're fighting on your side because you believe in natural rights. That's not what's happening here. The Spanish, the French, and the Dutch all looked at the British and said, the British are our enemy from a trade perspective. They are our adversaries. So whatever happens to hurt the British is good for us. So, since the Americans are hurting the British, we're going to help the Americans hurt the British even more so that we may benefit from it. And over the course of the Revolutionary War, Spain and Holland provide loans for the United States. France provides some loans. They provide just thousands of soldiers. They provide naval support for the Americans to the extent that at Yorktown, the definitive battle in the American Revolution, at the Battle of Yorktown, there are actually more French soldiers than there are American soldiers in the battlefield, which might explain why the British general, General Cornwallis, believed that when he surrendered, he needed to surrender to a French officer rather than to an American. Although I think most Americans prefer the story that he did it as a way to try to offend George Washington and try to prove superiority over George Washington. But the fact of the matter is there were more French soldiers on that battlefield than there were American soldiers. Now, incidentally, incidentally, there is a large contingent of slaves from Saint-Domingue. The French had promised via a treaty, they had promised thousands of soldiers to the United States, and they simply couldn't fill those ranks with average everyday Frenchmen. So the French had this colony in Saint-Domingue, which was this massive slave colony that grew sugarcane. So the French take this trip to Saint-Domingue and they start conscripting or drafting slaves from Saint-Domingue and say, you guys are going to North America and you're going to be fighting in this war against the British. So wrap your head around this paradox, if you will. You've got Americans saying that we are fighting for, quote, liberty because the British are trying to enslave us. And a big contingent of the soldiers that are fighting for their liberty are actual enslaved people from Saint-Domingue. So it's a very odd circumstance happening here in the American Revolution. So slaves play a huge role in all of this. And they play an even bigger role than just these people from San Domingue. Americans had a real problem when it came to slavery in the American Revolution. 20% of the American population was actually enslaved. That's 1 out of every 5. So if you have 1 out of every 5 in the populace enslaved, you are susceptible. If all of a sudden these enslaved people start hearing about liberty and the opposition of Americans to being enslaved by Great Britain, you got a real problem if these enslaved people start hearing it and start going, well, hey, what about us? So they're susceptible. The American colonists are susceptible. And the royal governor of Virginia knew all of this. Now, the royal governor of Virginia, a guy named John Murray, the fourth Earl of Dunmore, he had a real problem on his hands. He was out of troops. He was being invaded. The colonists were making real advances in 1779. And he concluded that he is at a desperation point. He needs to start conscripting people. He needs to start forcing people to fight for the British Empire. So he issues a proclamation. And among many things that he issues in this proclamation is a demand that people fight for the British government. But he also puts in that proclamation something very important. He says that any slave that runs away from their plantation and fights on the side of the British will earn their freedom. They will no longer be enslaved. They will earn their freedom by virtue of fighting for the British Empire. Now, I'd like to tell you that this was a thing that turned the tide in slavery, and it doesn't, unfortunately. But it does turn the tide in another way, in another area of the Revolutionary War. Now, first of all, approximately 1,100, this is the maximum number of enslaved people who joined Dunmore, and they formed these regiments that were referred to as quote-unquote Ethiopia regiments. But they wound up fighting in this Revolutionary War, and the British were true to their word. They did free all of these people after the Revolution, and dozens of them actually came from Thomas Jefferson's plantation. So Thomas Jefferson writes this document where he says, essentially, we're not going to be the slaves of Great Britain anymore, and dozens of his slaves said, yes, we agree, we're not going to be slaves anymore, and went and fought on the other side. But the bigger issue, the bigger result of Dunmore's proclamation is that there were thousands of loyalists across the country who came to a conclusion that was very tough for them to come to. They now concluded that the British were, in fact, trying to take their property away from them. By inciting enslaved people to run away, they were concluding Britain is taking our property. Just like those radicals said they were 5 years ago, we're now feeling it too. They are taking our property. If Great Britain takes away their property, it's akin to enslaving them. So those loyalists, instead of, remember, they had already been kind of pushed to the side by the British. The British, as they saw it, said, we don't want you guys. Now they've made enemy of the loyalists by inciting slaves to run away and join the British Army. So the Americans win this victory in the Revolutionary War. But I want to emphasize in closing that all of these things that I've mentioned, the 5 things that contribute to American victory, the issue of slavery, the issue of foreign support, the issue of guerrilla warfare, the lack of understanding of what to do with the loyalists, and the geographic and the geopolitical issues, all of these work in concert to defeat the British. There are a number of historians who say that victory in the Revolutionary War was inevitable, but nothing's inevitable. If any one of those 5 things, if you think of them like the legs of a stool, if any one of those 5 things is pulled apart, that stool becomes unstable. Okay? And all 5 of these things are critical to the American victory. I don't like to play what if history, but I'm going to suggest to you that if any one of these things had been taken away, then it would have been exponentially more difficult for the United States to have won victory in the Revolutionary War. So, this concludes the first part of United States History 1301. Your next task after this lecture would be to prepare yourself to take exam 1. So make sure you take the exam and then join me when we start looking at, in lecture 7, we start looking at what the United States is like after the Revolutionary War.